Hi, and welcome to today's webinar, Growing South Africa's Mining Industry Through Transformation. I'm Laura Cornish, Managing Editor for Mining Review Africa, and your moderator for today's discussion, which is brought to you by Erudite. In today's discussion, the speakers will discuss the importance of having a base of appropriately transformed industry players capable of executing project delivery for the growth and sustainability of South Africa's mining industry. Taking us on a journey through this topic are guest speakers, Johan de Bruyn, founder and CEO of Erudite Group of Companies, Vincent Razaroka, chairman for Erudite Group of Companies, and Mzila Mtinyane, executive head, stakeholder affairs for Exxaro Resources. To find out more about our panelists, you can toggle through the speaker tab at the top of your screen. Before we begin, we encourage you to use the question and answer box on the left-hand side of your screen and at any point throughout the discussion. Our panelists will endeavour to answer your questions within the allocated time. I'm now going to hand over to Johan, who will kick off today's session with an opening statement. Thanks very much, Johan.
Thank you very much. Guys, what a privilege to talk about transformation after such a weekend where we've truly seen what we can do when we pull together as a country. So well done to the Bokke. Guys, the mining industry in South Africa has played a significant role in the economy and the history of this country. It has played a key role in the training and development of technical skills, which has contributed handsomely to the caliber and depth of the technical capabilities in South Africa. Safety and environmental challenges facing the industry have added to the effects of the global financial crisis and caused a significant decline in the industry over the past decade. Shareholders demanding a short-term returns in a long-term industry and the imbalance and the perceived risks associated with our industry all contributed to an industry now trying to regain its enviable position in our economy. A poor track record in the transformation of the industry needs urgent focus from all stakeholders and at all levels, but the challenge is significant. From a service provider point of view, the extent of the problem is exacerbated by the substantial consolidation that has taken place over the past 5 to 10 years. Large engineering companies are often larger than their clients. From a transformation point of view, this yields a substantial challenge as these multinational entities are often held through international institutionalized shareholding. This leaves sustainable transformation almost out of reach. Mine owners in South Africa have been better at transformation than service providers, and the change is evident at board and decision-making level. Effective shareholding transformation is a greater challenge and will continue to be a focus area for management. We now have a situation where owners have no option but to engage with EPCMs through local versions of the multinational companies, which could potentially limit the benefit to SA and its people. It could take some time for new, sustainably transformed engineering service providers to create the capacity and track record of project delivery to earn the trust of the industry. A joint approach is certainly needed. In the heyday of the mining industry in the 70s, mining companies spent substantial portions of their profits on training programs and centers which contributed substantially to the skills base that entered these companies and ultimately ended in management positions. The skills drain to Australia and Canada is not helping as SA's mining industry loses its appeal. University bursaries used to embrace young talent and grow them with the industry, but not enough of that is happening these days. Erudite is proud to have been able to attract professional engineers with the quality and capability of Hector Mapeto, Bono Moguera, Glenn Nyakali, to name just a few. And young engineers like Moloko Mokokong have put her weight behind the Erudite story. This makes us very proud, and the strategy is successful due to the transparent and open-minded approach to transformation, employment, and shareholding that continues to challenge the norm. During this webinar, you will hear a strong message that centers around intent and responsibility, and the panelists will put forward a view with potential solutions to plot the way forward. How do we assist in the development of the transformation in our industry? Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much, Johan. We are now going to delve into this topic in a lot more detail. And to begin that and to start us off, I'm now going to hand over to Vince to lead us through a more in-depth discussion. Thanks, Vince.
Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity. I just want to go historical and say that in the mining industry, it was actually one of the shining lights of transformation post-1994. But most of the deals that were done post-1994 were symbolic deals where black people were actually asked to invest in the industry, and they were actually absent investors. And that model was supposed to showcase to the country that, people can work together, that people can become shareholders and owners in the mines. But there's been a lot of changes with mines. I mean, the way mining is being done, there's been a lot of changes. We've got, access to energy, new frontiers of exploration, the emphasis on health and safety, access to capital, volatility of commodity prices, environmental footprint, and economic inclusion, meaning, the relevance that, the different stakeholders like communities have got to participate. So we need to come up with new models on how we're actually going to transform the mining industry. And I believe that the sustainable way of actually doing transformation is we need to get previously disadvantaged people who have skin in the game, who have put money in, who've got the skills, who've trained in it, who work in that business, whose expectations are also matched with how the industry works instead of short-term, long-term, that understand that it's long-term. That also understand if you've got to attract investors, you've got to also match what the expectations are in terms of safety, the values that are required, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I think you need a new dawn in terms of new investors and new profiles of people that want to participate in the transformation of this sector.
Thanks so much, Vince. Ndila, would you like to add any thoughts on this at the beginning?
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate. I think I can echo both of what the previous speakers have said, and maybe in that regard talk from the perspective of Exxaro Resources. And maybe just to dial back to how Exxaro was started, because it talks to some of the issues that were mentioned by Vince. That Exxaro was started by some entrepreneurs, amongst which we may know Sipho Nkosi, who at the time had bought some coal and diversified mining assets to establish a company called ASCISWE. And fast forward to today, ASCISWE did several transactions of meaningful significance to the South African mining industry to form what is today Exxaro. And when we talk of skin in the game, those entrepreneurs who had skin in the game, and one of the stories that Sipho and Kolisi, our current CEO, often talks about is how they had to borrow money at prime plus 10 at the time to be able to acquire those assets. Think back to what would have been the thinking behind lending entrepreneurs at prime plus 10 back in the days. But I think the important thing, and one of the things I'd like to acknowledge about entrepreneurism today is that it's got to be including people who are involved and not shareholders who are absent. And one of the key examples, and I'd also attribute that to the success of Exxaro today, is having owner-managers in the investment and managing of this company today. So Nkolisi is one of the original founders, and he's currently the CEO, having taken over from Sipho. So I think we have an interesting discussion ahead of us, and I'll perhaps just pause at this point and see how we take it forward.
Cool. Gentlemen, thank you very much for starting this webinar with such great insights. I'm now going to hand the discussion back over to Vince, who will take us through with a slide presentation. Thanks so much, Vince.
Getting to this one.
Okay. The thing that I'd like to talk about is slow transformation during the past 25 years in the industry. The point that I really, really would like to make is in the last 25 years, the mindset of the previously excluded was actually a little bit biased, that they were actually invited and they were actually expecting what is the mining fraternity actually going to do to actually accept them in. I think we've got to change that narrative where we actually have to say we have young people that have actually got degrees, that have studied this trade. They are willing and they're actually keen to actually participate. Two, We listened to the Minister of Finance last week, and we also listened to the President. The issue on inclusivity of the previously disadvantaged in terms of the disparity on the sharing of the wealth in the country, that cannot carry on. So you've got to create space for previously disadvantaged people to come in. But what you also need to do is they also have to give you a business case as to what is it, what value are they actually going to bring, not just what is the businesses going to do to accommodate them. They've got to be able to come with a value proposition. What do I mean by that? They've got to have the skills that they are bringing. They've got to bring in the commitments. They've got to show that they actually buy into what are those challenges and actually understand what are the things that are actually driving mining going forward. So, and then the general lack of appropriate skills at all levels. All of us talk about how many kids go to university and they get the degrees, they never get a place. So we also have to start making the mining industry as attractive as it used to in the past. Because most people grew up with their parents actually living in the mines. That was a prime employer, and that has changed. So excuse the pun, but we've got to make mining sexy again. And then the other issue is inappropriate transformation through tenderpreneuring. I think the issue there is, if you look at the tenderpreneuring culture, was born out of this expectation that, because there were deals that were made at the beginning with people that didn't have skin in the game and, they became shareholders, they were not participating, people thought you can actually make money without actually working in the industry. That's not going to work, and that's got to change. I think, again, Tito did say that the proof of whether you've got a real deal to bring to the table is going to be based now shift to the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur now will get an opportunity to play, but they've got to show that they're able to play a game that actually comply to the rules. The days of actually just being a briefcase, a tenderpreneur, it's over. It's not going to work anymore. That's so wrong. That is what created some of the challenges that we have at the state, with people that have been standing at the commission.
Chihani, let me maybe take that a little bit further. Thank you, Vince. I think, that point about the burden of the competence shifting to the entrepreneur, Vince has touched upon that a little bit. But that is so key. The entrepreneur has to get out of the mindset of, what can be done for me, and rather bring that competence to the table, as Vince said. And what am I bringing to the table? What's the value add? I think it's a critical point for people to accept and to take forward, because it's about what we can do together rather than sort of standing and waiting. And with that, I'd like to say the mineral environment is complex post the GFC. And I think that's fundamentally founded in the concept of investor mentality that is short-term. And the mining industry is a long-term industry. It does not work when you do mining models that we're all very familiar with, that tries to get money back to the investor in the short term. It's a long-term game, and we need some long-term investors. And that's a complex mentality in a global environment where, there are ways where you can get shorter or quicker turnaround on your cash. The next point on there that talks about focus on compliance rather than intent. I think we are saying that we believe that that's part of the problem. The focus is on compliance when it comes to transformation, and we believe it should be on the intent. The founders of Erudite and Vince, we've said to each other right from the beginning that we need to create a company that lives the essence of what transformation in this country is about, to create a long-term sustainable business. And that's not about compliance. It's not about ticking boxes. It's about doing the right things with the right intent in achieving a sustainable reality, achieving a sustainable business that can be here for the future of this country. And you'll hear that throughout this presentation and our discussion. We feel very strongly about trying to do the right thing rather than trying tick the boxes, and we'll touch on that again when we talk further in this presentation. Then, whilst we're on the challenge, you would have seen in the public domain on Friday that AngloGold Ashanti had announced that they are planning to exit South Africa from their last asset. because the SA exposure is seen as negative. That's a reality. We cannot change that. But what we believe is part of the challenge is how do we create an environment where we have sustainable wealth creation, where an international investor can see the value and wants to be a part of this exciting South African story. So I think that's to sort of set the stage in terms of the challenge. And we'll hand over to Mzila now to talk a little bit about how it's seen from an owner's perspective. And we're very proud to have Mzila as part of this webinar today. I think Exxaro have done great things in terms of setting an example in terms of transformation.
Thank you very much for that challenge. And I think you've articulated very well that it's certainly the challenge that's facing the industry. And maybe just to take this opportunity to share some of our experiences at Exxaro and as far as how we've approached transformation. I think in the first instance, one of the things that we often say, and this is all the way from the top in terms of the board, that compliance is a minimum and not the end goal. And we've got to really see the legislation on transformation as like any generic model, just a broad guideline in terms of how to go about achieving transformation, broadly speaking. But I think in more specific terms, what transformation is about inclusive development of South African people. So from an Exxaro perspective, we have defined for ourselves a purpose as a company, which is about powering better lives in Africa and beyond. And it's quite a powerful statement to make and confers on us quite a huge responsibility, which we don't take very lightly. And transformation falls within that because, as I said, it is about inclusive development of people. And these are people's lives that we're dealing with. And so our transformation strategy is purpose-driven. And as a result, then, our business strategy is aligned to that in terms of what do we need to do to make sure that we achieve this purpose of driving transformation. And we do refer to the regulation as a minimum and a point of departure to begin our journey of transformation. But we then also superimpose some long-term and strategic goals in terms of, well, at the end of it, what is really this is about? I think in the first instance, it's about understanding where we come from, firstly as a country, and where Exxaro comes from as a company in terms of it being a product of South Africa's legislation. And everything thereon was then about what the various leaders have done to get Exxaro to where it is. And if I can refer to the various scorecards in terms of the GTR codes and the mining charter, they all pretty much have the same basic structure in terms of asset ownership, looking at economic well-being, if I can put it that way, employment equity in terms of people development and also moving upwards within the organization. And then a critical one, which is about enterprise and supply development, which is something that Vince spoke about earlier, in as far as how do we partner with enterprising individuals who want to build businesses. We all have come to understand how enterprises hold a future for South Africa's economic development. And then obviously community development as well. And I can elaborate on this in terms of some of the initiatives that we're taking on there. So overall, we regard these transformation scorecards really as a balanced scorecard, not looking at charitable giving, which is often associated with CSI, but also where we also participate on economic. And in the case of the mining charter, it also made reference to some environmental stewardship. And there are a couple of examples that I can talk about in terms of asset ownership from a sustainable transformation. And I think I don't want to dwell too much on Exxaro, but I think one of the key observations is that it shouldn't be about mere ownership of any and every asset, but it's got to be about ownership of a prosperous asset, because that's how economic empowerment takes place. To the extent that one does not get a successful asset, it doesn't matter whether you own 25% or 100%. 100% of naught equals naught, and that will not result in any empowerment. And that it requires that the people involved be competent people. So there was extensive mention of the need for skills. So the people involved in those transactions need to be people who are skilled and knowledgeable of those assets that they are participating in. And this is where employment equity becomes critical. So it's not employment equity for its sake in terms of having black faces and black women and young people at management or development, but it's about having competent people who know how to manage and run the business. And then from an enterprise and supply development, quite often, and we've seen in several instances where enterprise development and supply development has been about cleaning contracts and very peripheral economic participation in the procurement budget of companies. We've taken that further to, whilst I don't want to undermine that and underestimate its potential impact, it is also true that one cannot limit the potential development of people economically only to those peripheral services. We've then gone further to look at the extent to which entrepreneurs can be involved in the value chain of coal production at Exxaro. And this has included specific services of a certain size as a starting point with a view to growing the value of those contracts, and this is where supply development comes in. We have a special team that actually looks at how we assist small suppliers to become bigger. And the same for enterprises, where we've looked at enterprises outside of the mining value chain. So those people have some really wonderful ideas who can help in diversifying the local economies of the communities that they come from. And the combination of those two initiatives has really taught us lessons in the fact that there's some huge latent potential and capacity in South Africa. We really just have to begin to believe in that. And our enterprise and supply development is aligned to the codes in terms of providing largely grants and interest-free loans, to refer back to the Prime Plus 10 loan that was granted to our original founders. And we've seen how this has made a huge difference to small enterprises and entrepreneurs, firstly, in terms of enabling them to participate in the local economy and in our supply chain, but also enabling their businesses to be more sustainable in terms of working capital management and freeing up cash flow. So cash, which otherwise would have been demanded by interest payments, is now used for ensuring that people are able to be paid, the business is able to run, maintenance on equipment is being done, and we actually have the entrepreneur being concerned about the running of the business rather than the financing. And then from a community development perspective, I think this is for us providing some really interesting opportunities. So far, we've really only operated by ourselves, and this has largely been a compliance-driven mentality. But I think till about 3 to 5 years ago, we have begun to seek partnerships and collaborative relationships, not only with other mining companies, but also with non-mining companies, as well as with government. We've seen how in the recent past, mining operations have been invaded. We've also seen how mining communities have gone out into the streets because of poor service delivery. So each entity, in terms of both business and government, is actually facing the same challenges. But to the extent that we continue to work individually and separately to try and solve these challenges, the longer that these challenges will continue. And we've seen some very interesting opportunities in terms of working with both local and provincial government to establish the kind of collaborations that will enable us to pool our resources and be able to do bigger and better projects for communities. So in summary, that is really the story of Exxaro in terms of how we've approached transformation to try and make it sustainable, not just for ourselves as a company, but I think for the beneficiaries that we interact with. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you very much, Mzila. So if we move on to the next slide, then there, Laura, the service provider perspective. I think it flows very closely to what Mzila said, but we're facing substantial consolidation of our industry. And when we founded Erudite Strategies as a company 3 years or so ago, clients and friends were quick to point out that you're going up against some giants here, and it's a substantial challenge. We didn't see that as that at all. We embraced the opportunity to say, hang on, there's a place in the market for a truly sustainable, transformed business to provide services along the lines of what the bigger guys do. And we don't have to go up against them. They're not the enemy. We see ourselves as a vehicle that allows a place where people can come to be a part of and be part of a story of an entrepreneurial vision to build a new, truly South African business that is truly South African in every way. It has all the commitment and drive and knowledge of the mining industry that's come so many decades, but it's committed to the people of this country across the board. The skills that we've been able to attract are phenomenal, and we are so proud of that. So the challenge of the massive consolidation out there to us is only opportunity. We're very excited about where we are and what we've been able to do in our short life. The part of why we have been able to attract the talent is also because we're challenging employment and shareholding norms. We believe that there's been too much in terms of it can only be done this way and it can only be done that way. And we've just said off the bat, it doesn't matter how it's done, as long as it is constantly attracting talent and where we create an environment where entrepreneurial people can flourish, working norms, terms, all of these things that we need to challenge. We do so boldly, but that's attracted the people, and that's what people want to be a part of. So very excited about that. We've recently also formed an asset management company that can help us manage our own assets, where we're looking at fixed contracts with some of our clients. And that asset management company will be at least 51% owned and managed. Well, in fact, it will be almost entirely black managed and more than 51% owned. So trying to also set the example of what can be done. It doesn't matter what the opposition is doing. We are happy to take on the norms. We're happy to create new ways of doing things. And I'm sure we'll make some mistakes on the way, but we also embrace that and come out stronger on the other side. So that's really our perspective. I think it's an exciting landscape despite the challenges, despite where the mining industry finds itself, because I think it's pretty much at the bottom and it's on an upward curve, and we want to be part of that upward story. So very excited about that. I think let's just move on to some of the solutions, perhaps. Vince, would you mind just talking again, just touching on the intent versus compliance? I think we have touched on that already, but maybe just to sum that up, and then I'll take the rest.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I mean, I think you've already mentioned the issue on, intent versus compliance. I mean, I think, some of the compliance that has been happening in the transformation space in South Africa can be equated to malicious compliance. People actually try to find alternative ways to bypass real transformation. I believe that, the rules have changed. I don't think you have to own everything. I think in the new world, everybody understands that, the key word is collaboration and partnerships. And I'm sorry, I'm not selling Exxaro, but they are a true example on how you can actually deliver on what we're all aspiring for. I mean, it's a black-owned company. It's well-run. It's got values and everything. The same as with the Springboks. I mean, 10 years, 12 years back, we were still talking about color and can they do it and all that, etc. So if you really, really look at what are the solutions and approach, once you can define what are the key driving factors that's going to drive this whole industry and get it to grow, and you spec that, and you actually execute on what needs to be done, then you can be able to deliver like it was done over the weekend by the Springboks. Johan, you want to speak about AB InBev and craft beer industry? Example?
Absolutely, guys. I've always been quite a strong supporter of, from a business point of view, let's just get that right, from a business point of view, of what SAB in South Africa have achieved I think it's phenomenal what they've done through Africa, and I think it's just phenomenal what they've achieved as a South African company, setting some examples throughout the world. But the point I wanted to make here is AB InBev. You could argue that the craft beer industry is their enemy because it's purely a competitor. Yet AB InBev supports the craft beer industry. They offer free advice, service support. They send some of their best brewers out to these craft breweries and help them produce a better product. And if you ask why, the answer is actually quite simple. They are improving the market. They are making a better product for the whole market to improve. And it basically comes down the philosophy of when the tide rises, all boats float. And that's very much also what we're trying to do here. We collaborating with our clients, with other service providers, even some of the consolidated larger EPCM players, to try and get the mining industry back up and running, get the whole industry into a better place, and then everybody will benefit. So that's the whole logic. Zila, I think there was something you wanted to add in terms of just providing access to knowledge and support from, to emerging and junior mining companies. There's this whole concern about how does an emerging mining entrepreneur who's got his hands on an asset, how does he take that through the value chain? And I think there's quite a bit that one can do from our side and from the exile.
I think that's a great opportunity for large mining companies like ourselves. And I speak, on recollection of a presentation by Minerals Council in terms of how do we boost the South African exploration industry. And that, to the extent that we're able to, firstly, from a legislation that enables for young entrepreneurs to really seek their fortunes in this industry, we could get some great collaborative relationships between big companies and small companies in terms of imparting the knowledge and expertise of how to take a mining property from concept to mining development. I can't say I've experienced it in terms of having been involved, but I certainly see it as an opportunity. Having said that, it also does require that the holder of that property also be knowledgeable in terms of what will be involved in terms of developing a mining company, which is what we'll be aiming for at the end of the day. It will take long, and it will be a challenge to the extent that somebody who has not taken the time to provide themselves with the necessary knowledge on what mining is about in terms of the risks and opportunities, to then wanting to partner for the development of that mine. But it's certainly not impossible.
Yeah, if I can also just chip in there, I think also as business people, we do have a responsibility not to always just criticize the government, or when the country challenges are put on the table, we want to deny them. One of the big issues in the country is the land issues. And one other way that the Department of Mining and Energy and Minerals try to do, they give licenses for mining to communities. But these communities don't have the skills and all that, etc. Here's an opportunity for the big mine owners or service providers like ourselves. We've got to partner these communities to actually make those licenses viable. And the key operating with there is we've got to develop a new culture of sharing. It doesn't have to be winner takes all anymore. We've got to share in order to build a stable and sustainable South Africa. Thanks.
Thanks, Vince. Well, I think from the formal presentation point of view, that's really what we wanted to get through. I don't know if you want to move on to the questions at this stage.
Thanks, Johan. Thanks, gentlemen, for your insights and for sharing just how the South African mining industry has and can truly find success on a new level through transformation and skill sharing and transfer. We are going to continue the session now I'm going to facilitate a short discussion between our speakers. Johan, I'm going to start with you. What do you think are the main obstacles for mines to enhance renewable energy penetration? In other words, what is the role of renewable energy for the future of mining industry in South Africa?
Well, thank you for that. I think that's a question that came in through the week. And to the guy that asked the question, I think it's a very relevant question. Erudite founded itself on a number of things. One was being truly South African and sustainable in South Africa. The second was to be a service provider to external junior mining companies. And the third was to focus on the battery industry, battery-related commodities, which is commodities that are poorly understood in the market. And there's a lot of that out there. And we are currently, to just go back to the point that Nzila made, in terms of junior or emerging entrepreneurs in the mining industry, we've had the opportunity to partner with a community that has access to a vanadium resource, where we've said, okay, they have the resource, but they don't necessarily have an understanding of how to take that project through the value chain. So we've partnered with some of the larger mining companies to say, well, how do we fund some test work? How do we fund some initial study work? And how do we make sure that we get this thing off the ground? So we're trying to blend those things together. We're taking a battery-related commodity, which is firmly in the sweet spot of where Erudite is focusing, and we're partnering with the local community to make that project viable and take it up the value chain. So there's no doubt that renewable energy is the future. Everybody knows that. Just this morning there was an announcement where Tesla announced that they're very concerned about the commodity supplying product into batteries there will be a shortage. And that's exactly where we're trying to play. So we're focusing on all of those commodities. They are critical. The battery development of battery technology is critical. And there, without going into too much detail there, I think South Africa has a huge opportunity to play a significant role in the battery production going forward. And we're in advanced discussions with some players to see how we can participate in that, where we say that South Africa has got access to all of the mining knowledge, technology. It's got access to the bulk of the battery-related commodities from South and Southern Africa, Central Africa, where it makes so much sense to take all of those commodities, bring them to a central point where we've got the skills, we've got the electricity, and we're right on the harbors, and let's start playing properly in this space. So I think the obstacles is, once again, an understanding of those commodities. It's not like the conventional high-value commodities like a gold, where one starts off defining the resource, and when you've done that, you define the resource, and then you define the resource, and that defines the whole project. When it comes to those sorts of commodities that are associated with renewable energy, it's all about understanding the market. It's not so much about the resource. And that means a complete mind shift in terms of understanding how you put a project together. You've got to put the project together with the market in mind rather than the resource in mind. And those are the sort of things that we're working through and we're learning as we go. But there's no doubt that South Africa can play a substantial role, in my opinion, in renewable energy, in energy storage, and getting ourselves into a space where renewables will play a bigger role.
Thanks, Johan, very much. I think the next question I'm going to address to Vince, and Nzila, maybe you'd like to comment afterwards. It's sort of the burning question that we're dealing with in this webinar, which is how much are investors willing to invest in small South African businesses that want to become involved in the industry? How do you uplift small, micro, and medium enterprises for young entrepreneurs? Vince, do you want to start us off on that question?
Yeah, I'd like to start answering that by actually saying it's the wrong question. I think we've got to have a paradigm shift as previously disadvantaged in South Africa. Everybody sits in their own areas, and they always ask, what can other people do for us? I think we've got to change that. We've got to start having a mentality of actually marketing and selling ourselves. People that have got a passion for the mining industry have got to demonstrate to potential investors that they really, really are driven and they have the passion for the industry, that they're not only in it for the money, they're in it because they love it and they want to make a difference in their own communities. They also have to demonstrate that they will be great partners for their international investors, that they share the same values in terms of safety, health, good corporate governance, like I've said, and various other values that they can bring to the table, that, they're in tune with their communities, they will share, they'll bring stability, they are sensitive to other stakeholders, and that, their investments will not perish. Thanks. I'll pass on to Mzila.
Thanks, Vince. So I think my contribution to that would be that let's also accept that not every asset is investable, and therefore not every ore body is one that will necessarily translate into a mining company at some point. I think we've spoken at length about the issue of skills, and within that, I think, is the concept of risk and understanding of risk and return. So you can have a large ore body which will require a hell of a lot of capital, but if the return on that invested capital will not justify the risk, it doesn't matter how good it may look. It will at best probably wait until the time is right, because the market is appropriate in terms of pricing to be able to invest in it. But I think the point here to this question is one that we've got to accept that just because the ore body is black owned doesn't make it investable. That doesn't come first in terms of a decision to invest. And thereafter, then are all the other things that Vince has mentioned that, once the decision to invest has been made, it's got to be in such a way that the input costs or the cost of running that company will not be such that they overwhelm the potential revenues and profits, because then down the line, it then erodes from the potential value. Because at the end of the day, the whole purpose of creating any business is to make money and to generate a return and a profit for both the owner and his and her shareholders. Thanks.
Thanks, Nzila. In terms of transformation, Vince, how is the transformation of the industry, specifically with regards to skills and entrepreneurship development in a local context, being facilitated?
You're asking?
Just muted.
Oh, sorry. I think you need to bring in young people into the industry. And I think the big minds will have to also take responsibility to help invest, in the youth. So you can be able to have a pool of future leaders in this space to actually pick from.
Well, yeah, I'd like to support what Vince is saying there. In the opening statement, we made a point around, many moons ago in the 70s, there were lots of programs that many of the mining companies drove development and had all these training facilities, and it was a very attractive industry to be in. People wanted to be there, and some of our best skilled people came out of one of the mining companies' development programs, more so perhaps even than the universities, because they were hands-on, focused on what the mines needed. And I think we've agreed that that's part of what we need to do as an industry. We've got to get people attracted back into the mining industry, which means there's a bigger responsibility. We've got to make the mining industry profitable. So it's a place where people want to build a future. And I think in terms of a South African content, if we're able to get the transformation of the industry right, we will also attract more people to be wanting to be a part of that. So it is definitely a joint responsibility. It's something that we as an industry need to tackle. And we're already finding that. I'm privileged to be quite involved with one of the larger technical universities. And we're seeing more and more excitement around a technical education, a technical employment career in the long term. And that means from a mining point of view, we are finding more people that want to be a part of that. So I think we're heading in the right direction, but it needs commitment for more. Zila wants to add to that.
Yeah, I thought it would be an appropriate time maybe to add what I'm about to say in the context of, the forthcoming South Africa Investment Conference, which begins tomorrow and over the next couple of days. That we've got to understand the linkages that exist amongst the need for development of people, particularly from the skills to be able to participate economically and successfully in this industry, and investment which result in a thriving industry. We have seen how the industry has really been struggling to grow for a number of reasons which we don't necessarily have to touch on now. That's an important starting point, and I think it applies to lots of other industries, to the extent that we can have a lot more mining companies or mining exploration taking place, shafts being built. And this I'm making reference to what Johan mentioned earlier on in terms of what mining companies did in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And I can say that I myself am a product of those previous training developments programs in terms of training centers, which just about every mining house had, and remembering the structured training to understand what mining is about, not only post-university, but during university in terms of VAC work. By the time that you left the academic training, you had a very good understanding of what mining was all about. But not everyone is going to have that opportunity. So this is where internships also play a role. And that as well is something which a lot of the training schools back then provided for mining-specific skills, and not just from a drilling and blasting, so to speak, but across the whole value chain of mining. So we really do need that. But I think it does begin with an increased investment in exploration, which then results in the development of new mines.
Sorry, Angela, one of the things, that we've, that I think I missed out on is we also have an opportunity as South Africa. I mean, we're also part of Africa, but there are Africa opportunities. We should really, really take our rightful place to say anybody that wants to come outside of Africa, that wants to do business in the mining space, we as South Africans should take the lead. I mean, if you look at worldwide, I mean, Canada and Australia are actually seen as leaders. They go out and actually do more deals in Africa than we do. We've got to take our rightful place and actually go into Africa and get those opportunities for ourselves.
Absolutely, Vince. I think we've proven as the South African mining community that we have those T-shirts. There are very few countries on this continent where we haven't been active. We understand the difference between doing business in Ghana versus Cote d'Ivoire, even they might be neighbors. It's so important that we take that position as a leader, because yes, the Aussies have done a lot in Africa, and so have the Canadians, but we understand it better. We sit in the time zone. We are the ideal partner for an international mining company that wants to play in Africa.
Gentlemen, thanks very much. I'm going to wrap up the discussion portion of our webinar, and I'm going to take us into the audience question and answer session. And just to remind the audience that they can enter their questions and submit to us on the left-hand side of the screen. And just to remind our audience as well that if the question isn't answered, we will share those questions with the speakers to respond as they see fit afterwards. All right, in terms of our questions, Nzila, our first audience question is for you. And they're asking, is the cash flow of emerging black-led businesses a consideration going forward?
Absolutely. Cash is king, and I think it's important for anyone establishing a business to consider cash flow going forward. But I think if I understand the question properly, it is from a perspective of seeking financing for that business. So the way we look at it in terms of our enterprise development is firstly from a supplier development. This would be an entrepreneur who has an existing contract and has an opportunity to actually increase the value of that contract. And the supplier development aspect comes in us extending some funding to be able to buy additional assets and resources and provide that service. So there the cash flow is pretty secure because it's Exxaro taking a risk on itself. So that actually then is a much better opportunity. From an enterprise development perspective, where there is no relationship with Exxaro, what we look at is the potential impact that loan would make. But I think it's that loan or grant would make to that entrepreneur in terms of extending of that funding. What is important here on the part of the entrepreneur is the extent to which they have an understanding of the market and can provide a convincing argument that they'll be able to secure market for their product or service, and also convince us of their ability to collect cash. What also becomes a big risk, and here it applies to both enterprises, as I've defined them, and supplier enterprises, is their working capital management. And we try and play a role in terms of assisting them with how they manage the business going forward in that regard.
Thanks very much, Mzila. Johan, our next audience question I'm going to address with yourself. How can we align ourselves with producers to share the vision in providing long-term returns on investment?
Okay, producers, I'm assuming we're talking about mining companies. And I guess the question is from a service provider point of view. In other words, how do we align ourselves as a service provider with a mining company for long term? If I'm getting the question right, I think we've touched on the principles throughout the discussion. Firstly, it's the point that Vince made about the responsibility that shifts across to the entrepreneur to prove competence, to show initiative, to show value, and for the producer to see that this is not a compliance thing. This is real value that achieves the intent of transformation. So there's clearly a certain amount of communication, call it marketing, involved, where one has to prove one's worth and explain that value to the producer. And I think those relationships are ultimately key to the success of your company, because in the mining industry, where it's a business-to-business entity or business-to-business relationship, it's all about relationships. It's relationships that are built over long periods of time, and yes, it's tough to get a foot in the door, but you have to keep chipping at that rock so that you get to build yourself a reputation, and that you build relationships with the people that ultimately become your client. It's not so much about lowest price always. Whenever in my career we've done assessments with our clients as to what is it that helps you make a decision. Yes, price is always an issue, and of late price is more and more an issue, but it's never, ever the only issue. It's about quality. Nobody can afford in a long-term investment where your biggest decision that you make as a mine owner is probably the engineer you choose to develop your project for you. People have realized that. So there's a lot more time and effort going into who's your partner, where's the value, and is it sustainable or not. So if you're a new entrant into the game, it's all about communicating and convincing the producers of the value you add and building that relationship.
Maybe if I can add to that, Johan, from an owner's perspective, and we recently hosted a supplier awards, which was a first for Exxaro this year. And one of the key things, or a couple of key things that came out of that, some of which you've mentioned, is that for a company like Exxaro, like very many other mining companies, we're going through significant transformation and changes as a result, not only of legislative changes, but I think some systemic changes that are taking place in our environment, ranging from a coal mining company, climate change, and then secondly, disruptive technologies, which are leaving no place to hide for any companies. And as a result, it's placed a huge emphasis on relationships in our value chain. And from a service provider perspective, I think this is where companies like Erudite come into this discussion to say, to what extent is there that alignment that you're referring to between the service provider and the owner in terms of ensuring that both parties remain successful. And this applies also to the other side of the equation in terms of the relationship between Exxaro and the customer. But for the purpose of this webinar, I think the points that you mentioned are absolutely critical. because in this time of change, a company like Exxaro is looking at how it remains to be the most efficient in terms of the production of coal and other minerals, how it continues to be a safe operating and healthy, providing for a healthy environment for its employees, and also being able to deliver a cost-effective product to the other end to its customers. And to the extent that suppliers are not aligned and there isn't that ecosystem type of relationship with the owner, it does leave the service provider at a disadvantage because it is a very competitive environment. And to the extent that service providers are not also coming to the party in terms of assisting owners in being more efficient in how they conduct their business, then it will be somebody else's opportunity that's left on the table.
Nzila, thank you very much. Vince, the next question is not really a question, but more of a statement, but I'd like to hear your comments on it. They're saying that the mining sector isn't transformed because it is seen as an exclusive terrain, and that makes it difficult for talented young black people to actively seek to participate in mining, especially downstream. Vince, what are your comments and thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, to be honest, to answer that question, I think it's maybe a limitation on exposure of not speaking to industry captains. I think in the last hour we've just heard the demonstration on Exxaro on how supportive it is and all that, etc. I think through webinars that we're currently having now and with businesses like ourselves as Erudite, if the person that's asking the question would like to maybe, get in touch with ourselves so we can actually point them in the right direction, we're quite willing to do so either with a senior miner or with a service provider like ourselves. My biggest challenge that I'm making, especially to young folks coming up, is that we've got to change our mindset. Half the time in the country, we always ask, what are the other people going to do to us? What is the industry going to do for us? You don't have to do that. You'll never get called. You've got to go out there and be aggressive and say, I want to be in that space and I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to find where Mzila is. I'm going to find where Vince is. And I'm going to find where Johan is. Give them a call. You don't have to speak to the current people on the line. There's lots of players in that space. Go and find out how did they get in and make it your business to make sure that you're going to go in. Because if you don't go catch it, nobody will give it to you.
Vince, that's awesome. Thank you so much. We've got time for one more question. And Zila, this one is for you. What is your view on a junior miner versus an emerging miner?
Thanks for that question. My understanding of a junior miner has really been premised on what I've observed from Australia and Canada. And I think it has some key characteristics in terms of what I've seen. So firstly, you find that from a technical perspective, the kind of ore bodies that they're dealing with are relatively small ore bodies. And they will exploit that ore body with the minimum of input resources and be able to make a marginal return on them. But they're not looking at it from how rich they get, in terms of how quickly they get rich, but rather the profit that they make, which they can then reinvest in another ore body. With emerging miners, it sounds like a bit of a contradiction because, below the junior miner category, you're really getting into exploration. And emerging miner kind of sounds like still lacking experience, still trying out and exploring what the possibilities are. So that will be my distinction between the two. But I think what we really need to get are junior miners who also consist of some very capable people who will have retired or left the industry to go pursue their own fortunes.
Zila, interesting. Thanks very much. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time left for any questions anymore. So I'd like to thank our speakers and our audience for delivering an excellent discussion today. I hope you've gained great value from today's webinar that will spark further discussions throughout the year. I'd like to remind you that a recording of today's webinar will be available on demand on the Mining Review Africa website. Thank you all for joining. Goodbye.